Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Lawton. I'm Special Projects Editorial Director at SC Media and your host for today's webcast. Welcome to Digging Down into a Resilient Infrastructure. Today's webcast is sponsored by Capsulate. 2020 webcasts are a production of the SC Media Editorial Department. You can think of this as a fireside chat with a subject matter expert on a topic of interest to security professionals. This is not a product pitch. With that said, let's move on. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Shortridge, Vice President of Product Strategy at Capsulate. Kelly brings experience in innovative defensive research, threat modeling, and market analysis to the company. Prior to joining Capsulate, she served at Security Scorecard, BAE Systems Applied Intelligence, Hyperlane, and Teneo. There will be a Q&A following the presentation, so we encourage you to type in any questions you might have for Kelly via the interface. Welcome, Kelly. Let's get started. In our last 2020 webcast with Capsulate, we discussed the importance of building resilience into your security program. As we continue this discussion on cyber resilience, we'll take a deeper dive into determining your resilience, looking at what components constitute a resilient framework, and how to measure your resilient strategy in making an impact. Among the topics we'll discuss are practices and metrics that security teams should consider when developing a resilient environment. The last time we talked a lot about what resilience is and why you need it. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive here. First, however, we need to define terms. What is the difference between talking about cybersecurity and cyber resilience, and is there a difference between being resilient when someone is trying to disrupt your operations versus someone who's just trying to steal your data?
That's a great question, Stephen. I don't really think there's any difference in cybersecurity and cyber resilience, really. I think a sound cybersecurity strategy is one that should be resilient too. I think people imagine there's some sort of delineation because the benefits often engendered by resilience, such as reliability or stability, aren't really seen necessarily as security benefits all of the time. I think what people are missing in that conversation is that security should also care about reliability and stability. And so just because those are ancillary benefits beyond security, it doesn't mean that it's not worth pursuing resilience in a security context too. And I think while some sort of specific implementation as far as how a resilience strategy looks, the general principle around resilience generally should hold true regardless of whatever scenario or specific organizational context, because a lot of resilience is making sure an attack results in as minimal of cost as possible to the organization, which can include minimizing downtime in an operational disruption case, but can also include minimizing the amount of data that can be stolen at one time or in one place. So ultimately, resilience is about enterprises and organizations needing to test how well their systems can handle failure, whether that failure is due to DDoS, attacker going after their user credentials, ransomware, and so on. So I think when we think about cybersecurity, really to do cybersecurity right, we need to follow a resilience strategy.
So resilience really is incorporating not only security, but also business continuity. Is that right?
I think so. I think business continuity is often an ignored thing in information security. And I think a lot of information security practitioners like to think of themselves in this sort of, trench or particular silo, but ultimately security needs to be about empowering the organization to continue on in spite of digital risks, and part of that is also business continuity. So at the very least, they should work together with any business continuity professionals and certainly kind of the broader IT organization within an organization.
What are the components of a resilient framework, and how does that work? And I guess a better question to start with, is framework the right term, or Is it strategy? Is it something completely different? And does that really matter what we call it?
It's a good question. I think framework is for sure one of those words that means different things to different people. I ultimately like to think about resilience, as I said, as a strategy, because I like the idea that regardless of domain, a strategy implies there is some sort of plan that's at a high enough level that it's able to guide actions across this range of possible scenarios, but always with a specific goal in mind. So there's that kind of underpinning of flexibility while the eye is on the prize. So I tend to say that a resilient strategy is the right way to think about it rather than a framework, both because it's a bit less nebulous and also because I think it's really getting to the heart of what resilience means. So the goal is resilience, and now you have to figure out what sort of resources and obviously actions will help you get to that goal. So the word framework feels, I guess, a bit too passive to me. So, as a personal example, if you think about, you want to be able to go to the gym, if you have a workout strategy versus a workout framework, I think the workout strategy sounds a lot more like you're actually going to go to the gym versus a framework. And I think in the context of information security, a strategy sounds like something that's actually going to have action following it, whereas a framework kind of sounds a bit more like the passive check the box sort of stuff that we hear a lot of the time.
When you boil it all down, there are, at least in my perspective, 4 parts to this strategy: identifying and detecting your essential assets, managing and protecting them, responding to an attack, and then the recovery phase, and also the business part of all this, the governance and having C-suite buy-in. That this is an essential part of your overall cyber defenses. Easy to say, really hard to do. First off, do you agree with these components that I've laid out? And second, how do you get the C-suite and the board, which might not necessarily understand resilience and what it means and why it's important, to invest in such a program?
Yeah, those are 2 great questions. I'll tackle each of them separately, though. I'll definitely say that CISOs feel a lot of trepidation around speaking to the board. So first, I think as far as the 4 components, those sound a bit like the NIST guidelines to me more than anything else. And I think they're also very InfoSec specific. But I think when we think about resilience, part of the beauty of it is that it applies to any complex system. Information security just happens to be one of them. And ultimately, across any domain, resilience is about robustness, adaptability, and transformability. Obviously, most people focus on robustness, which is about withstanding some sort of attack. So it's things like, do you have layered and diverse controls to make sure that there aren't any gaps? Is it game over, for example, if a user clicks on some sort of phishing link that downloads ransomware? Does your whole system fall over? Obviously, that shouldn't happen. Then there's adaptability. So that's around, can you reduce the costs and damage incurred from an attack while also keeping your options open down the road? So that would include continually testing systems to see how they operate in worst case scenarios, having an architecture that allows for change based on what you learn from those scenarios. And that leads into transformability, which is, are you migrating away from essentially hazardous conditions just in a digital context? So are you considering, for instance, how to better integrate security into your organization's workflows? How frequently are you challenging your assumptions? Is your underlying infrastructure pretty changeable and flexible? So all of that combined, I think the beauty also of thinking about it kind of in this complex system context and keeping it a little more general, I think it makes it a lot easier for the C-suite and board to digest. And I actually think resilience is one of the concepts that's the most easily digestible kind of by that group of stakeholders, partially because you can also combine forces with other parts of the organization. So a classic example as far as resilience engineering is a tool like Chaos Monkey by Netflix that can help reduce attacker persistence because instances are randomly killed. The attacker has a hard time figuring out whether they can actually maintain a foothold or not, which is fantastic, obviously, from a security point of view. But the tool was originally designed to test a system's ability to withstand failure generally to make sure that there was plenty of uptime in Netflix's systems. Obviously, uptime means more revenue or at the very least lower costs. And those are sorts of terms that the board obviously likes to hear in the sort of the context they prefer. making some sort of argument just about, security is important for security's sake doesn't go over very well with that group of people. But if you start tying it to, the risk to the organization, I think it's a lot more powerful. So I think because resilience really is focused on evolving your organizational security based on the environment and context around it as that evolves, I would say it's fundamentally more aligned with business priorities than kind of the old school security checklist model that prioritizes security for security's sake, really over security that will support the organization's ongoing and future operations. And that's what resilience really represents.
Well, you made an interesting point. We're spending a lot of time talking about CISOs and the IT network, but virtually every major structure has a second network, an infrastructure network that's run by operations. It would include like the HVAC system and other non-IT data systems. Resilience obviously would be essential in that kind of network as well. Are these operations people aware, and are they spending time building resilience into their network the same way that the CISO is building resilience into the IT network?
Yeah, absolutely. They're actually well ahead of us. At least I'm less familiar with kind of physical infrastructure as I am with digital infrastructure, but infra ops or DevOps, SRE, site reliability engineering, whatever you want to call them, have been focused on resilience engineering a lot longer than security has, actually. So I think, if anything, CISOs are definitely behind the curve on what's out there. I won't say that resilience is, in every single organization, DevOps even is still a struggle for most companies, but I would say it's much more adopted among engineering teams than it is among security teams specifically.
Interesting. When you think about it, the first three parts of building a resilient network, as we talked about, really is not rocket science. We talk to CISOs all the time about these kinds of issues, but not always at the same time. We seem to break these pieces apart. Why is it that some companies will have these basic components really well organized, but not necessarily have a cyber resilience strategy in and of itself? They seem to understand the component parts of it, but they fall short when they're actually, when it comes time to build that overarching strategy.
Yeah, I think resilience isn't necessarily totally understood yet in the security industry. And I feel like people are really starting to talk about it now, particularly at the CISO level, not just kind of the more junior security engineer level. I think also from my experience, I think a lot of security challenges, even outside of just resilience generally, people may know kind of some of the basics of security hygiene, but they still struggle to implement them. But I think the fundamental problem with resilience specifically is that the mindset still among security teams and certainly among CISOs is often they want to go back to this sort of business as usual, go back to the status quo after some sort of incident, or at least have a plan to go back to business as usual in case they're attacked. But the point that I think is really missed is that business as usual, if it was attacked or there was some sort of unwanted incident, it means that the business as usual was clearly vulnerable to that sort of unwanted event. So it isn't this sort of state, of being that's actually healthy for companies. So I think that's the danger of focusing, for instance, on just robustness, as I mentioned earlier. You have to be able to ensure adaptability and transformability. Otherwise, you're going to just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over.
Yeah, if business as usual was so secure, the breach never would have happened.
Precisely.
I'd like to take a moment here to remind our listeners that you can send Kelly your questions through the interface, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of this discussion. So, okay, we've talked a bit, and we understand the strategy. Now comes the hard part. How do you implement it? I'm not keen on talking about words like best practices because, in my opinion, that best practices is more of a marketing term and not real specific. But can you talk a little bit about how to take these various components of cybersecurity and make a cohesive plan that will work not only with your GRC requirements, but with your overall security plans and programs in general?
I definitely agree with you that best practices, kind of like framework, is a very nebulous term these days. I think, as far as how you actually implement resilience, I think step one is definitely understanding the business priorities. So what would cripple your organization from the business perspective? So by that, I mean, don't even think about security when starting this sort of thought exercise. Just focus on the ultimate consequence. So for example, if you were like a software company, a crippling event could be that 20% of your customers can't access the flagship product because you would lose so much revenue and customer confidence and so forth. Or if you're in something like manufacturing, what if your equipment goes offline for a day? How many widgets do you lose out on making? And then from there, once you've established those, again, without kind of the security lens, you then add the security lens back in. I think you could also call it the digital risk lens to make sure you're focusing on the right things. So then the concern becomes, going back to the 20% of customers can't access their flagship product, then it's, the risk is we're worried about availability to our flagship product. So once you have that, you marry that scenario or those scenarios with the attacker perspective. And it's important here to think about the attacker ROI. So how would an attacker gain or benefit from disrupting availability in the product? Is it something incidental as they try to grab, the user credentials that are present in the product? How difficult would it be for them to do so? Would it be really costly? They would have to use, zero-day vulnerabilities. Like that would be very expensive for them. So these sorts of questions help you figure out which threats are not just high importance to the business, but also the ones that are most likely pursued from attackers. And that helps you prioritize really what to tackle first. I also think the danger with all of this, and going back to kind of the older school way of thinking rather than the resilience thinking is, you see all these potential paths for the attacker, you weight them roughly equally, and then you try to block the path at each step. And I don't think that really one is particularly productive because you don't have unlimited budgets, and I don't think that constraint is likely to change anytime soon. But also, it's certainly not conducive to resilience. So I think you have to focus on the end result, which means you have to keep the threat somewhat open-ended when discussing it. So again, it's focusing on things like we're worried about availability to our flagship products because then the first step is really testing availability and how that component is resilience. So where resilience engineering comes in, for example, as I said, in the DevOps world, they already have lots of tools to inject failure and systematically determine the ways that availability can be eroded, and then obviously fixing things based on those findings. So once you've kind of tested all the different ways realistically that availability can be shut down, you've ideally fixed it, you can then use the knowledge of which attacker avenues are the most likely from the attacker's cost-benefit standpoint and figure out then which paths make the most sense to close down, because it's not all weighted equally. There's some things that just don't matter to your business, and there's some things that just aren't feasible for attackers, so it makes no sense to try to secure those.
Is there any special training that the IT staff should have when it comes to building a resilience strategy, or do they basically have the training they already need and they just don't necessarily know the plan?
It's a good question. I think a lot of security training probably goes against the notion of resilience. Again, thinking about kind of the checklist model, and one thing I've observed a lot is there's this notion of, absolute security, that for every organization there's, this model where they would be perfectly secure and they've done all the security things they need to do. And I think actually being able to understand the business perspective is more important in a lot of cases, or it's certainly something that needs to be taken into account more. So for instance, if you are some sort of transportation company, you may care less about the credit card data because you're not storing very much, and you could invest a ton of time and effort in making sure that's totally locked down. Or you can make sure that, your schedules and some of the, let's say, the signaling and other transportation, like actual physical infrastructures that are protected, because if that was attacked, your business would suffer a lot more. There would be a direct loss of revenue, whereas with the credit cards, if maybe there's a small compliance fine, it doesn't really matter. So I think unlearning this notion of, we're on this kind of crusade to make our organization perfectly secure, and we constantly have to fight for security's relevance is the wrong perspective. And thinking about what matters to the business is. I think, it comes in waves, but I think we're seeing more people cross-pollinate between the DevOps and SRE worlds as well as information security. It's still pretty slow at this point, but it is starting to happen, and I think that's a valuable tool to, frankly, until tooling in the industry catches up. Right now, most organizations have to build their custom tools to do proper resilience testing and borrow from, for example, infrastructure operations rather than security tools, because there aren't any really to test security resilience right now. So being able to also have a developer hat on is really valuable. But I think, as far as I know, there aren't really many training programs out there that are leading people to think from kind of this resilience perspective rather than the kind of checkbox security we're all already used to, and that doesn't necessarily result in better outcomes.
Well, yeah, you run into the problem of, if somebody had a great business mind, they might have gone on to the business side rather than into, DevOps, and this really requires expertise in, having your feet in both areas. That is a challenge, and I don't know a lot of developer types that really like putting on a suit and going and talking to the board. that can be a challenge as well.
Yeah.
So, we've talked about a variety of elements here. How do you measure success? What metrics do you use to determine if you've done the job well?
That's also a good question. I think metrics come up a lot in the security discussion. I would say most organizations, if they're tracking them at all, aren't necessarily doing a great job. Part of that is just lack of data. Part of that is not even knowing what to measure. And that's one area where we can really draw from the DevOps and SRE community. So, the rigorous testing I mentioned before, being able to test how well you can handle failure, obviously produces the data. And even if you're doing a very manual effort, you can pretty quickly tell, yes or no, our system completely imploded when this, simulated user downloaded ransomware. So that's one way to measure it, even on a manual basis. But again, drawing from the DevOps community, there are metrics that we can adopt. I would say chief among those is mean time to recovery, which is basically how quickly you can get the service or asset operational again. So you could also think about it as mean time to remediation if you want in a security context. I think the important thing there is some people misinterpret this is it doesn't prescribe how you make it operational. Again, it doesn't mean that you go back necessarily to business as usual. It just means, your operations are humming along again, that it's working however it was supposed to be working originally, even if now it's been re-architected, for example. So I think sometimes there's a danger in how these metrics are used to justify kind of sticking to the status quo or inaction. That doesn't make sense. So one, for example, that definitely shouldn't be used is mean time to failure. Some people use a mean time to breach or compromise sort of metric, which for one is just kind of depressing and negative. But if you really think about it, the best way, generally you are what you measure, right? And for mean time to failure, one way to have an amazing mean time to failure metric is if you air gap everything, you require, a bajillion access controls to use each system, your failure rate's going to be pretty low, if zero. Your organization would absolutely suffer, though. Nothing would get done, and everyone would probably hate you. So that's not a good one to optimize. And then something like mean time to recovery instead tends to promote innovation and flexibility, because again, it's about how quickly can you get up and running again. I think the other thing a lot of people overlook with resilience is that a big chunk of it is somewhat about culture and certainly about cultivating influence within the organization. Again, a big chunk of it is being able to adapt to the environment around you. You have to understand the rest of your organization. You have to understand how your employees, your fellow colleagues are actually conducting their work, and make sure that security is integrated into that. Because if they don't respect the security team, they're probably going to try to go around the controls that you implement. So one thing you can do is measure the Net Promoter Score, which is a common thing used among particularly consumer products to measure how happy customers are with the service or the app. So most people in the audience have probably seen, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend, this product to a friend? So obviously it's not about recommending the security team to a friend, but it is, maybe how excited are you to work with the security team? Or even you can make it kind of a joke, like how likely would you be to recommend the security team to another organization, right? And that gives you a good sense of how much the rest of your colleagues believe that the security team is aligned with priorities, that they understand the needs of the organization, that they're trying to work with the organization rather than against the organization. Because ultimately, you'll never, ever be able to implement even a resilience strategy if you don't get buy-in from everyone else, and if they don't trust that you kind of have the organization's best interests in mind. And this is one place where a lot of security teams fail, because they push through changes without really acknowledging the user perspective, their colleagues' perspective. So they're seen as these kind of, I tend to call them crusaders that are just on this quest to implement security, which generally means that people won't be likely to work with you. And again, with resilience, you have to always be thinking about the way your organization operates, because ultimately it's about protecting the business's ongoing operations.
Well, it's that old argument of the CISO who wants everything to be secure versus the CIO who just wants the trains to run on time.
Right.
That's almost a religious debate,
mm-hmm.
Between those two groups, and it goes back to the beginning of the computing industry. Aside from money, and that's always a big aside, why do senior executives not recognize the importance of having this strategy in place? I ask this not because, if it was easy and obvious, everyone would do it, but they don't. So, what's the resistance? Is it just that they don't understand? Nobody's ever explained to them why they need it?
I think education may be part of it. Again, there's been 20 years of talking about this kind of checklist security and the notion of perfect, absolute security for any organization. And that's only just starting to change, and resilience has only really been spoken about in any meaningful way, I think, for the past few years. But I think generally speaking, security is a really draining industry, frankly. I think CISOs and even the team below them, it can feel hard to create a strategy when you're constantly putting out fires, and it feels like things are changing all the time, and you're just, paddling to stay afloat. So this is actually one reason why I don't like frameworks, and I especially don't like the checkbox strategies, because I think strategies need to start with a goal. In this case, it would be resilience. And you also have to acknowledge what uncertainties exist. What's the kind of chaos in your surrounding environment, because that can actually lead to some innovation and creative thinking. I think a strategy ultimately should be flexible, it should be malleable, it's adaptable as the environment changes, because ultimately it means the path to the goal changes. And I think the problem arises when CISOs think that they have to stick to a certain path, and that, that path is the only way to the goal, or they make goals so, micro and detailed that there's really no other path than the one they've already defined. So there's a huge difference between a strategy and a plan. So even in a military context, like you're fighting a battle, the overall strategy probably stays the same even as conditions fluctuate, but the specific plan of attack can change, and it should be similar in information security, and that's something resilience really embraces, that flexibility. But I would say that flexibility hasn't exactly been a popular mind state, I would say, in information security. It's very much like, because of all the uncertainty and because of all the fires and, this feeling of an overwhelming threat landscape, though I think it changes less than defenders would like to admit, it means that they want these sort of concrete plans, that they want a very specific path forward, and they think less about the overall goal, and they think less in terms of, okay, this changed on us, but we can still do X, Y, and Z to reach our goal. More like, okay, we have no idea what to do now. Now we have to scramble. So I think it's a really fundamental change that has to happen, and I don't think it can happen overnight. I mean, it's like overhauling your morning routine. That's not something that happens easily, despite people's best New Year's resolution attempts. So I think there's certainly empathy required, which obviously plays into the education around resilience as well. It's not easy to go from the very anxious firefighting mode to a much more strategic and calmer, in some ways go with the flow as long as it meets your end goal sort of mind space.
Well, I think part of the reason for that is because a lot of companies have to meet compliance regulations as well, and compliance can be rather strict. So it's awfully hard to change strategies, mid-game if everything depends on being able to meet, these various rules, regulations, laws. And it can be very, very expensive to try to do that as well. I see that we actually have run out of time. I am sorry that we have not been able to get to questions from the audience. All of your questions will be turned over to Kelly and her team, and they will be able to get back to you after the event, of course, to answer any questions that you had. We could discuss this for hours and hours, but unfortunately, we're simply out of time. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Look forward to talking with Kelly again in the future. And thank you all for spending the time with us. This does conclude today's 2020 webcast, Digging Down into the Resilient Infrastructure. Thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you may be. We hope to see you soon.